Welcome, and the purpose of this video is to integrate some of the information and data we talked about in our historical lectures, our lectures on the history of Israel and the history of the canon and the history of the New Testament and the early Christian community, and talk about some broader questions now that we have those historical frameworks in place.
Sure.
So, the first question we're going to start with, and I'll pose this one to Eric and let him begin. What is the most important historical moment? I guess we would say for the New Testament or for the early church? How do you want to deal with
say
that?
the New Testament. I think. So for me, it's the year 70. And so I talked about this in the lecture. It's when the temple is destroyed. It's kind of a moment of massive trauma. Not just because of the violence that it involved, but also because of the symbolic importance of it. So if this powerful empire can destroy God's home, then can that God still be trusted? And to me, all the Gospels are written in the wake of those questions. It's what does this destruction of the temple mean? Even Paul's letters, although they're all written leading up to those years of the destruction of the temple. I think there's a sense in which people know something's about to change. There's something in the air, and it poses these significant questions for these early communities of believers. I think it probably is a big reason that these communities start spreading and start finding new homes, and it's important because there are things analogous to this in our own lives. I think I probably talked about this in the lecture, but the closest I can get to reimagining what that must have been like is to imagine, although some of our students may not remember this too well because they're in elementary school maybe, but to remember, the morning of 9/11 and that moment of trauma when you felt the world disrupted, that the way the world normally runs is turned upside down and you're not quite sure what's going to happen next.
Yeah.
But imagine that it's not just your centers of government and the economy that are struck, but also the very heart of your faith. And when that is struck, then what kind of cataclysmic moment is that for people? And I think that's the hinge for so much of the New Testament.
And what's interesting about that point is that it's also a hinge for Judaism. Rabbinic Judaism, and really the Judaism as we know it today is really the child of Rabbinic Judaism, as opposed to, it's more of a child of Rabbinic Judaism than it is of a temple-based Judaism, is another way of saying that. And that is a key moment for them, because what the rabbis do is allow Judaism to exist without a temple. Yeah, it's diasporic religion.
It's a radical change.
It's a radical change. I don't think we really realize how radical that actually is. And the centrality of the temple to Judaism now is still expressed in prayers. There are prayers for the temple. There are times of mourning for the temple, and there's even a small group within Israel now that wants to rebuild yet another temple.
It's not quite the same thing, but in Luke Acts, in these texts, what you have are, at the end of the Gospel of Luke, the disciples go back to the temple and they're there praying and praising.
Yeah.
At the beginning of the book of Acts, that's where they are. And Paul, if you ever look at those maps of Paul's missionary journeys, he's always coming back to Jerusalem. So even though this book is written after the temple is destroyed, it's still a center of belonging for these early Christians. So how do we make sense of that? I think it's a real challenge for us, which I think asks the question then about why we're spending this whole week talking about things that are about before the Bible, because this is a text that didn't come out of nowhere, didn't fall from the sky, it wasn't this kind of oracular thing, but it emerges from the very real concerns that people who are looking for ways to follow God are experiencing. So whether it's the destruction of the temple or what would be the critical turning point?
Remarkably, it's the destruction of the first temple, right?
It's always temples.
Yeah, it's all these temples, but that's not an accident, because in Hebrew, I won't say in the original Hebrew because Dr. Barreto said we shouldn't use naughty language. But in Hebrew, the word for temple is Beit Adonai, or Beit Yahweh. It's the house. Within the Near East, these temples were understood to be the dwelling places of God. And so, go ahead.
It's not a church at all, right?
It is not a church.
So kind of to emphasize that, it's not a place you go just to worship.
That's right.
But it's actually a place where God kind of fully dwells. Would that be right? Or like that?
Yeah, there's a focused presence there. No, that's absolutely right. It is the place where the priesthood, or these mediators of God's presence, are functioning. And so, yeah, it's a place where we have the concentrated presence of God, or
that's a good way to put it.
yeah, God is there in a focused way and for specific cultic purposes. Not cultic in the sense of like
Not David Koresh.
right, thank you, exactly right. But cultic in the sense of ritual practice.
They may not know that reference either.
Well, go ahead.
Oh,
Okay, all right.
Look it up on Wikipedia.
Yeah, Wikipedia, the answer to all things. So I would say that the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in roughly 587, 586, but in those 2 years you have a campaign that spills over into both, and the destruction of the temple and the deportation of mostly the elites of Jerusalem of the time is the most significant event within Israelite history, and it casts a shadow over almost every book in the Hebrew Bible. One would be hard-pressed to find a book that is not affected on some level by the exile. So the destruction of these two temples, apparently, had a major impact.
Yeah.
And the fact that, I guess when I think about Hebrews, the book of Hebrews, right? That's a book that shows that the temple actually matters to Christians still. But the temple is not just some thing that was in the past.
They didn't shrug their shoulders.
Yeah,
like the early
that's
Christians,
right.
I think, would have been as traumatized. Right, so there's a question about at what point do these followers of Jesus become something different than a sect of Judaism, than a subsect, right? There's at some point, Christians and Jews become different in some significant sense.
Right.
But when the New Testament is being written, I think it's probably still too early for that. I think
Yeah,
there's still,
right.
from an outsider's perspective, they would see Jews.
They would see a
whether
sect of
they were
Judaism,
following Jesus or not. So I think, it broaches some really interesting historical questions for us. I think one of the things we both emphasized were some of these differences. And you wanted to highlight a couple of these kind of big cultural differences between our world and the world of antiquity.
Yeah, this is really important. When you're reading ancient literature, it's, the writers had different sorts of assumptions about what literature was, what it was attempting to do. And so what I'm actually going to do is share with you a couple of insights from a guy named Jean-Louis Scott, who works at the Pontifical Institute in Rome, and he has this great book called Introduction to Reading the Pentateuch, and he provides 4 features of ancient literature that I think are helpful for us today. So the first one is what he calls the law of antiquity or precedence, and what he's arguing there is that, in the modern world, I think we have a tendency to say what is new is more authoritative or whatever. We trust newer research as opposed to older research.
And I, if you have one of those big Zach Morris phones, another reference they may not get, big Zach Morris phone, we laugh. And it's not that long ago, or even the original iPhone looks like a dinosaur,
beast,
right? So that I think it's in our culture that newer is better.
That's right. And within the ancient world, authority resided in that which was ancient and not in that which was newer. One great example, this is why you have genealogies, right? And this is why you have a primeval history. That's a technical term for Genesis 1 through 11. You root the story of Israel in antiquity.
As far back as you can go.
As far back as you can go, and in this case, it's all the way back to the beginning.
So I think I mentioned this in my lecture, but there's this great example of a Jewish historian in Egypt who's writing history of Israel and of ancient Jews, and he notes that Moses, because Moses was in Egypt, that Moses taught the Egyptians everything they knew. That Moses taught them mathematics, taught them astronomy, and even taught them how to worship the gods.
Oh, wow.
So why do you do that? You do that because everybody knows that Egypt is an ancient civilization.
Yeah.
And if you can say, well, we were here before them, then there's a sense of antiquity, right? And we've been here for a long time. So
I think that's exactly right.
It's a pretty important difference.
It's a huge difference. And so just keep that in mind, when you're reading these biblical texts and thinking, why are they so interested in the ancient past? Why does that even matter? It matters because that's where authority is.
Yep.
Secondly, the law of conservation, nothing is eliminated. This is a principle that is related to scribes and to the copying of biblical texts, which I mentioned in my lecture. And there is a tendency really to be conservative with the traditions that have been received. There are some really interesting cases of omissions, and actually, if you're interested in those things, email me and I'll send you a book on that deals with omissions within the Bible. But by and large, there is a tendency to conserve what one receives. And so what that means is that, think about Genesis 1 through 3. right? We have these two creation stories, as we're going to learn. And why keep both? What's the deal here? If you have, and there are some very clear contradictions there. Why would you put these two things in tension with one another? Well, in part because you conserve what has been received from the past. The same thing could be said for laws. Why in the Pentateuch are there laws that contradict one another? Well, in part because you don't erase stuff that came from the past. You keep it, even if it has been superseded by something else.
Some of those instincts are still carried forward. So if you think about the story of the woman who's accused of adultery in the Gospel of John, everybody pretty much agrees it probably wasn't in the original text. Whatever the original text of John, it wasn't there. You find it in the manuscripts. Sometimes it's at the end of chapter 7, sometimes it's different. It's all over the place. It's clear nobody quite knew where to put it in.
Wow.
But we kept it. And notice we still keep it, even though we have it in double brackets in the Bible.
Or the ending of Mark, too.
Or the end of Mark, which we'll talk about next couple of weeks. You have this ending that everybody knows wasn't part of the original ending, but we maintain it. The tradition has maintained it, and that's something. There's a little bit of continuity there because although we're much more willing to delete things, I think.
That's right, and probably because we don't respect the antiquities as much as they did. The law of continuity and updating, that's the third one, and that has to do with the fact that there was this tendency within the ancient world to attempt to make ancient texts breathe again. And this is something that I think we can actually relate to. And so we find many, many examples within the manuscripts of the Hebrew Bible, instances where people are trying to update and make the text either comprehensible or relevant for the day. And so that's yet another law. I imagine there are probably some things
good
like
example
that.
of it.
Yeah. And then fourthly, the law of economy, only what is necessary is to be written. And this has to do with the technology of writing. We just have to remember, we can sit down and type something on a Word document and it doesn't cost us anything.
100,000 words. Whether it's one word or 100,000 words, whatever.
It doesn't matter. You can do it for free. But you can't do that in the ancient world, right? Scrolls are expensive. I don't know about papyrus in terms of its, the economy, but scrolls, which are more permanent and which was the chosen medium for, at least within Judaism and within the Hebrew Bible, that's expensive stuff. And so you can only do that every so often. You can't do it all the time.
Right. Yeah. And two, that there's a kind of specialized training.
That's right.
That's involved with this. And I think the other thing, this might be interesting as we talk about, it too, is literacy.
Right. That's right.
Like to have the kind of free time that we have, that we get to sit around and learn how to read, and now you get to sit around for a couple of years and do seminary study, in a world where there's not excess capital, that's not really possible. So there's going to be a very small number of very specialized people who are probably able to do this kind of work. And people may be able, even everyday people might be able to have some sort of literacy skills. Yeah. But when we're talking about writing these very important texts, it's going to be reserved for...
Or reading them, for that matter.
For a very small number.
I mean, the estimates vary within ancient Israel in terms of literacy rates and high literacy rates, and you're looking at maybe 7%. Right. And most of those people are, privileged, educated, and they're these scribes who are in turn tied, as I said in my lecture, to the palace and the temple primarily.
Right. Good. So I think there's a lot of questions here we might ask, especially about how, if that world is so different than ours, can these texts still speak to us, or are they so foreign? Are they so different that they're long gone for us? Yeah. There's a sense in which I think we're in this odd tension. One, we need to help kind of emphasize how different these texts are. Yeah. How they are not products of our own culture. They're not products of our history. And that there is this requisite knowledge that we need to gather to be able to properly contextualize these texts and so they can speak. At the same time, too, I think there's also this confession that even as they're foreign texts, they're also our kind of that's where we're most at home. I mean, it's one of our confessions that this was God's word for them. It continues to be God's word for us. So kind of dwelling in that tension of a strange text, but also a familiar text. Both of those are true for us.
I think that's right. And let me quote Terry Fredheim here for a minute. Some of you may know Terry Fredheim from readings. He's he's emeritus professor here. And he has a great line at the beginning of one of his books on the Pentateuch. And he says, reading the Bible is a cross-cultural experience. Every time we enter into that text, we are entering into a culture that's so different from our own. And I think we have to keep that in mind, that this is an alien text. And so I think part of our job as interpreters, as leaders within the church, as professors, and as various types of leaders within the church, we have to make this an alien text. Sometimes it's too familiar to us, right? And that can be a problem. And so we have to hold that in tension with the fact that this is, in many ways, the language of the church. Right? This is where we get our theological language and our imagination. We talked earlier about biblical imagination. Yeah. And so that tension has to be there.
And there's a line there where can we teach this stuff in a way that doesn't say, look, unless you know all this history, don't even bother reading the Bible.
Right.
Which is also not true.
Helpful.
So
That's not true.
There's a balance here I think we're trying to draw theologically. But
Yeah, and we might also say that process is alive within the canon itself. So just as one really brief example, Second Isaiah, which is a way of talking about 40 through 55, the chapters 40 through 55, reinterpret the Exodus event in light of the Babylonian exile. And so what happens there is, this actually has to do with the continuity rule that I was just talking about. There is an attempt there to say, okay, there was this Exodus in the past, but we're actually experiencing a new Exodus. And so there's this way of drawing an analogy that I think is, in many ways, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to actualize this text as leaders and recognize that it has a past, but it can also have a present tense life.
Yeah, wonderful.
Yeah.
Awesome.
So
we could just talk about
we could forever.
Sorry about that. So your forum prompts for this week all ready to go, and we'll talk to you next week.
Talk to you soon.